Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is part 4 of my talks on the Dharma. In the previous parts, we looked at the difference between real Dharma and conventional Dharma, formulated teachings, the need for a path, the 3 main types of person that the Buddha's teachings can help, and so on. And today we'll look back at the teachings themselves that the Buddha gave us. As we know, for 45 years he wandered as a teacher and gave his advice, his counsel in response to people's requests, to their questions, or their simple asking him to give them a teaching. These make various discourses, sometimes gathered together as the shorter discourses, or the middle-length ones, or the longer ones. But what happened in the 16th, 17th centuries after the Buddha's passing in India was that the great and the wisest masters looked back on all those 45 years and they gathered together the information, like all the things the Buddha said about karma here and there. And they present it as a whole, and they analyze it, and they structure it to make it much more understandable and accessible for us. Those works which present to us the Buddha's teaching are called shastras. They're not simply commentaries, because a commentary is something that takes an original text and comments word by word or idea by idea. These are much more than that. These are the encyclopedias. These are the analyses of the Buddha's teaching. The Dharma went to Tibet quite late, so the Tibetans, based on the Buddha's teaching and on the Shastras, look back on what the Buddha taught with an overview that sees it as having happened in 3 main phases. They see a basis which really puts in place the fundamentals of the Buddha's teaching, and then a further development in a second phase, and then a final phase in which the deepest of truths and the real, in a way, the whole point of the Buddha's teaching emerges. They call these 3 main steps or phases of the Buddha's teaching the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma. The idea of a wheel is used. Wheels were in use in India, huge water wheels to take the water from the streams, and other wheels for transport. One wheel, something that turns and turns, is the wheel of suffering, the wheel of samsara, meaning that situations of suffering occur over and over again, and they will do as long as the cause that makes them is there. As long as we still have a need for affection and love, we will be seeking friendship, lovers, partners. As long as we still have very fixed ideas, rigid ideas, then they will be in conflict with other people's ideas, and this often gives rise to anger, fighting. As long as we're proud and jealous, again and again we'll be in situations of competition with others. And all of those causes for the situations, those emotional needs and fixed realities in us, come from our storytelling of ourselves and others, as we've seen. So that causes the wheel of suffering that will go on and on and on unless we bring it to an end. So the wheel of Dharma is the remedy for that. It's the turning yet again of the wheel of universal truths. In a way, obvious wisdom, as we've seen. Dharma means simply pointing out the way things are and showing that our suffering comes because of our illusions. So the Tibetans, based on the Indian Mahayanists, see the Buddha's teaching as being those three turnings of the wheel of Dharma. And the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, which is based on the four great truths, really lays the basis for all the rest. It represents the Buddha's teachings that all Buddhists accept and try to practice. And it's very important that we understand those first. Sometimes these days, by the way things happen, we sort of jump in at the deep end and we get the teachings based on the third phase first without really appreciating that fundamental point. So, first things first, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, and that is based on these four great truths, which you'll usually see called the Four Noble Truths, which is a rough translation. It actually means the four truths of noble beings. Noble beings means Aryas, sometimes called realized beings or free beings. What makes them free forever is their profound, in-depth, crystal clear, direct recognition of the truth of those four truths. It's their four truths. It's a good example of the difference between real Dharma and conventional, conceptualized Dharma. They actually become free forever. That's why they become Aryas, through those four truths. And we can talk about them, write about them, describe in words what happens, but the words, the conventional Dharma, the teachings that a Lama can give, is not the same as what really happens in that amazing time of breaking free forever. So these are the four truths of realized beings. And we have these as the famous first teaching or first sermon of the Buddha. That is probably a simplified summary. It will be very unlikely that those were his first words to his first disciples. More than likely, it's a very useful short form. Either he used himself in his lifetime, or that came when the teachings were formulated. Because the actual story is that when the Buddha left the palace, he became an ascetic with 5 other ascetics. They practiced asceticism to a terrible extent. Not eating, not drinking, sitting in the hot Indian sun, and so on. But anyway, after 6 years, the Buddha ceased his asceticism, and the other 5 kind of gave up on him. They went off. Soon after that, the Buddha achieved his total enlightenment, and they were drawn back to him by his magnificent presence, by their own karma and destiny. They became his first 5 disciples, and the actual story is that 2 of them would go out begging for food for all of them, while the other 3 would take teachings. They took it in turns to do that, so it obviously took some days, perhaps some weeks, perhaps some months, for the Buddha to really communicate to them what he'd realized, and to help them to progress so that they were very sure about heading towards that realization themselves. So it looks like a question of weeks and months, not just a question of the few minutes it takes to say that first discourse. But anyway, doesn't matter. What is interest for us is the content of the 4 truths. So the 4 truths are the truth of suffering and its causes, and the truth of freedom from suffering and its causes. They make 2 pairs of cause and effect. Suffering, its causes, freedom from suffering and its cause, the path. If we call suffering samsara, and we call freedom from suffering nirvana, We have suffering, its causes, nirvana, its causes. It's all about suffering then. And the Buddha, in his teachings, and Buddhism, focuses on suffering. Some people find this miserable. They say, a bit of a gloomy faith, isn't it? But suffering is terrible. If there is suffering in us, in others, and if there's a way to understand it, remove it, then surely it's our duty as human beings, as wise, caring beings, to address it. And that's really the central message of the Buddha's teaching. Not to go off into some artificial state, but to address the whole question of suffering in the world. But in order to really understand what the Buddha means by suffering, we need to know that it's not just what we mean when we use that word, suffering. That's only part of it. Otherwise, we can't understand when Dharma says everything is suffering, because it sounds totally over the top. On a beautiful spring day when you feel full of the beauty and the joy of life, how can you say all is suffering? So of course, we need to understand what we mean by suffering in Dharma. We talk about suffering and the truth of suffering, the truth of the freedom of suffering, all those things. Suffering in 3 areas, and only one of those 3 areas is what most people will call suffering. And in our 3 definitions, that one that everyone would think of as suffering is called suffering as suffering, or obvious suffering, we can say. That is when physically it hurts, there's pain, there's hunger, there's thirst, there's sickness, there's war, aggression. Or when mentally it hurts, there's anger, there's loneliness, there's frustration, there are desires that are unfulfilled, all of the things that pain the mind. So that everyone would say, oh, he's suffering, she's suffering, either physically or mentally. That first area of suffering is explored in terms of the 6 realms of beings, the 6 realms of the wheel of life, to see what mixtures of happiness and suffering relatively we have, humans, dogs, cats, butterflies, spirits, and other beings. And looking at the cost. For instance, you can't be human without being born. You have to go through childbirth, growing up. You have to go through aging, death, dying. It's part of the overall package. It's part of the cost of our human joys and pleasures. So one studies that. It's the obvious aspect. But there are 2 more things that are defined as suffering, which are not obvious to most people. The second one is called the suffering of change, or suffering as change. And this is only a suffering if you're observing what's happening with eyes of wisdom, with a mind of wisdom that knows the consequences of what's being done. To take a simple example, if we believe in karma, cause and effect, when a hunter, shooter, shoots a bird, a pheasant, then maybe that's the thrill of the week for that person, to look at that person is happy, satisfied. But if we believe in karma, that very moment of shooting is creating a suffering for the person who does it. It's like shooting yourself. Maybe the pain that will come back and the difficulty is much more than that few seconds of pleasure. And of course, not to mention the pain for the bird that was shot. So if one looks at that situation with an eyes of wisdom, beside the ethical wrongness of killing others for one's own pleasure. One can see the stupidity of creating suffering in the future for oneself through what one's doing to get a bit of happiness now. To take a more complicated example, more arguable example, but anyway, our industrial revolution, our technological revolution. Now when we look back at what happened in the last 200 years, we can see that the way we're going is endangering this one and only home, our planet, where we live. Maybe the very existence of humanity is threatened. I'm sure now if wise people went back and if they had the power to change things, they'd do things very differently. Not just in the doing of science, but in the very thinking of where are we going with our human civilizations. But we didn't have that insight at the time. On the contrary, it felt like we were doing something fantastic. Evolution, development, freedom, bringing gifts to humankind, making things better. It's a very positive vision, felt very good. Didn't at all feel like now we're putting the knife into the world and turning it in the wound. Not at all. So this second type of suffering is only obvious to eyes of wisdom, and it's when things look good just now. It looks like happiness, but one knows that intrinsically, by the very nature of what's being done, suffering is being pre-programmed for the future. And there's a psychological dimension to this too, because sometimes the very way we cling to people with love and attachment, because of who they are, how they feel, what they do to us, that very clinging which brings us our joy and our love, means that there must be some pain afterwards, because people change, we change, the situation changes. So those beautiful moments, so delightful, will go away. The suffering of change. And there's a third suffering which is the most subtle, it's the most poignant of all of them. But it's only understood by those who have deep spiritual realization, because their mind is free. Their mind is happy and rich in qualities. And only when you get there do you realize, but everyone's mind could be this happy, this much out of its bondage. And as a being like that looks around, and they see the fragile constructs that make our happiness and our suffering, our hopes and our fears, then they realize the relative suffering that nearly all beings are in. The suffering of simply not being what we could be, not inheriting our birthright of a brilliant, happy, beautiful mind. So it's because of those, all three, that Buddhism has this vision of the different types of suffering and wants to get rid of them. The second of the great truths looks into, but why? Why is there hunger and thirst? And why is there all or any of those sufferings? And we see the actual sufferings, suffering as suffering, comes through karma, what we've done in the past. And then we say, but why did we do that? And we see because those karmas that cause suffering are the karmas that harm other beings, harm ourselves. We did those because of a selfish mind, an angry mind, a jealous, proud mind. So we look at the kleshas which poison the mind. We say, but why do we have these poisons in the mind? And we see they're there because of the way we construct the story of me and others. The ego constructs the ego belief. And why is that there? These dualistic projections of self and other. That's because of our ignorance. So the second truth is a vast exploration of the reasons for those sufferings. The third truth asks the question, is there such a thing as being free forever from those different types of suffering and their causes? And the Buddhist answer is yes, not just yes in theory, but yes because hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions have achieved it. Today, people are alive who've achieved it, or who are very, very well on the way to it. That freedom is called nirvana. And in the fourth truth, we look at the path of practice, the Dharma path, the path of peace that leads to it. All the things we need to know, to master, to practice, to meditate, to practice in relation to life and each other. So they are the four truths, the four great truths that form the first phase of the teachings. Very famously, they're summed up in the three areas called the three baskets, or the Tripitaka, of the Buddha's teaching. The sutras, which mainly deal with taming the mind, especially through meditation. The Vinaya, which gives us our code of conduct, good ethics as human beings. And then the Abhidharma, which gives us our Buddhist science, our analysis of mind and matter. That first turning of the wheel of Dharma, summed up in the Tripitaka and summed up as the four great truths, was the first phase of the Buddha's teaching. All of the Buddha's teaching is meant to be a very real help for you and for me, not some abstract philosophy. So we need to apply those things to ourselves. That's where all the value is, in our own minds, to see in our lives, am I suffering? Physically, mentally? Am I pre-programming suffering for myself in the future? Am I hurting others, hurting myself by what I'm doing? And then we need to look, if we find still suffering and ignorance in ourselves, to find why it's there, to understand the causes, to understand the path that we ourselves can apply. So we need to face our own life and situation, to recognize it frankly, vividly, nakedly as it is, and to deal with it efficiently, happily, joyfully, because there is a possibility of doing something very wonderful with our lives. So I think that's it for today, and obviously we need to go on to yet another part, probably the Dharma part 5, because we need to go on to the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, about the Bodhisattva path, the Mahayana path, the way to become a Buddha, and the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, about the Buddha nature teachings that really help us understand who we really are, what life really is. Thank you so much for sharing these Dharma moments with me, and I wish you a very, very wonderful day, wherever you are. Bye-bye, and see you soon, I hope.